Hi, I'm Alex Beard and I'm here to talk about the future of learning. Now, I am aware that there's not that much that I can teach you in Estonia. You've got great schools, great teachers, great tech. You've got beautiful music, wonderful singing, the world's best composer. Your chocolate's really good, and even your ice cream is good too. So instead of trying to teach you something today, I'd like to tell you a story. And that story begins 12 years ago in a classroom just off the Old Kent Road in London. It's London's cheapest monopoly property. And it was my first day as an English teacher with a group of 12-year-old kids. And at first, we really struggled. The children didn't know much about Shakespeare, but I knew even less about teaching. I'd been to this lovely primary school in the countryside and then on to a secondary school that looked a little bit like Harry Potter's Hogwarts. And I thought that teaching was really simple. You just stood at the front of the classroom and talked about ideas, like I'd seen Robin Williams do in Dead Poets Society. But this was a long way from the movies. The kids I taught faced real challenges. About half of them were on free school meals. About 2/3 of them spoke English as a second language. And all of them came from these two big estates called the Haygate and the Aylesbury that were known for their high levels of crime. And all of the kids came to school a few years behind where they should have been in their reading and their writing. And it was frustrating. The kids were smart and witty, but they just weren't doing well academically. And around us, I was aware that the world was changing really fast. The students, they lived in the future and they were using smartphones, spending all night playing Call of Duty online. But I felt like the methods I was using to teach them were old-fashioned, that they might have been familiar to Socrates back in ancient Greece. And as a teacher, I felt really pushed towards focusing on their exam grades, helping them master the skills they needed to pass the end-of-year tests. At the same time, I was aware that the summer that those students left school, it was predicted that about 40% of the jobs that they were planning on doing as adults were likely to be automated by robots by the time they reached their 30th birthdays. And I thought if that was the case, we had to be doing a lot better with the way that we educated them. At the same time, I was hopeful. Though school was stuck in the past, I was aware that we were making these advances in understanding the brain in neuroscience and psychology and early child development, and advances in our technology in AI and the internet and augmented reality and data analytics. And I thought if we could harness these things and give teachers new tools, then we might be able to transform education and get more out of our minds than we ever had before. But what are our minds capable of? What is it that students today should be learning if they're going to thrive in this uncertain future? These were two questions that set me off on a round-the-world trip into the future that became a book I wrote called Natural Born Learners. It took in groundbreaking schools on 6 different continents, meetings with teachers and scientists and technologists at the cutting edge of their fields. And it left me sure of one thing above all, that in this age of AI and online learning, the future doesn't rest on some new invention or piece of technology, but on the development of our human potential. But I'd like to begin talking about brain power. So today we're aware that human intelligence is under threat. In 1997, when Garry Kasparov lost to IBM's Deep Blue, it was famously seen as a sign that computer minds were becoming more powerful than our human minds. People began to predict this thing called the singularity, when we might merge our minds with machines and transcend the biological limitations of our brains. But I wasn't sure that we should be giving up on our human brains just yet. And so to find out how much we are capable of learning, I travelled first to Korea. There, on a warm Thursday morning in November, I found myself standing outside a concrete school hall in Songdo Future City on the outskirts of Seoul, as all across the country, hundreds of thousands of Korean teenagers were sitting down to the 8 grueling hours of the Sunyung. which is an exam that takes place on a single day each year and is considered to be the world's toughest. Afterwards, school leavers are given a national ranking that defines the rest of their lives, which job they can do, which university they can go to, their whole health, wealth and happiness. And I was there to hear the story of a boy called Seung-bin Lee, who is a softly spoken, mild-mannered 17-year-old boy who at that moment on that Thursday morning was sitting inside the exam hall, his hands shaking, about to get started. The country was exam crazy. Earlier that morning, as happens every year, police on motorbikes had lined the streets, ready to escort anybody that was running late to get to the exam hall on time. In the days leading up to the Sunyang, newspapers ran articles about what food to eat for optimal performance, what clothes to wear, even what offerings to leave at the temple for the best luck. Most remarkably, in the 45 minutes of the English listening exam, all flights in the entire country were grounded so as not to affect the kids' concentration whilst they were listening to the tapes. So it sort of appeared to me that Korean learning was all about this idea of marginal gains, all about little movements that you could make to improve your performance. Afterwards, Seung-bin told me that after entering the exam hall, he'd worried about overheating during the exam and that it would affect his performance. And so halfway through, he had gone to the bathroom and removed his underpants as he thought that would help him to do better. So success, it seemed to me, was in these details. He even said that it was better not to think in the exam. You had to enter the zone and become an instrument of pure exam-taking technique. Now, it's really extreme, but South Korea does actually show us the power of education on our minds. After the Korean War 60 years ago, the country was depending on foreign aid, and 4 in 5 Koreans were illiterate. Since then, its GDP has grown 40,000%. The country is now home to companies like Hyundai and Samsung that are world leaders. It's also now got the highest proportion of graduates per population of any country in the world. When the OECD did its PISA test in 2010, Korea came out on top. Now, this is a man-made miracle. I spoke to a former education minister who told me, look, our country doesn't have any resources. We just have our minds and the ability to work hard. Now, that hard work is also taking a heavy toll. Before I left South Korea, Seung-bin showed me his revision calendar. In the 3 years leading up to the Sunyang, he'd studied 14 hours a day, 5 days a week to prepare, and 12 hours a day on both Saturday and Sunday. He told me that to relax, once a month he would watch a DVD. It's perhaps not surprising that Korea has the highest teen suicide rate in the world. Some adults I spoke to cried when they recalled their school days. One successful entrepreneur even told me that her hair had fallen out when she was a teenager because of the stress. When I asked Seung-bin what he did to beat the stress before I left, he simply told me, I know it sounds strange, but I just have to work even harder. So Korea shows us the power of education in developing our minds, but it's not without its issues. Policymakers there are worried about the lack of creativity that's being developed in the student population. And it's no longer clear that the approach is working for the 21st century. Although South Korea's got the highest proportion of graduates to population in the world, it's also already got the highest proportion of robot to human workers of any country. So I left Korea thinking that our brains were capable of more than we realised. But I'd also heard that we might harness computers to make our minds more powerful. And I wanted to know if that really was the case. And so I travelled to Silicon Valley, point zero of this tech tsunami that swept the world. At a place called Rocket Ship Schools in San Jose, I caught a glimpse of my first robot teacher. But it wasn't an android with a human face, but rather a piece of intelligent software inside an online learning environment. At Rocket Ship Schools, they've got something called the Learning Lab. And I went there with the head teacher, Miss Guerrero, after I watched her lead the whole school of 500 kids, in a sing and dance along to Shake It Off by Taylor Swift, which she called Morning Coffee for the Kids. So in this cavernous room, I then saw 120 5-year-old children, each dressed in a purple polo shirt and wearing these big outsized headphones, sitting in long rows, each of them in front of a laptop. And the room was eerily silent, except for the sound of small fingers tapping on keys. Each of the students was using a program called ST Maths or Lexa, and as they were working on their maths or their language, the software was beginning to understand them and their individual strengths and weaknesses, and then intelligently adapting the experience to each individual student, so they got just the exercises they needed to build on their strengths or to tackle their weaknesses. The tech was also gathering data on the kids' actions every couple of seconds, and then feeding back all of this information and data to the teachers. There were no teachers in the lab whilst the kids were working there. The kids would spend 60 or 90 minutes in the room each day, and the only adults there were a pair of untrained supervisors. Now it sounds eerie, but it also works. Rocketeers, which is what they call the kids, outperform students from other similar backgrounds. But I also wondered if it really made sense for machines to be teaching kids things like spelling and multiplication, that the machines could already be doing much better than the students themselves. Now, a similar thought had actually occurred to Garry Kasparov after his defeat of Deep Blue at chess. He wondered if chess could be rescued from the dominance of the machine. And for a short time, actually, human players developed these anti-computer styles, using patterns of moves that machines couldn't decipher. Then a new challenge was invented. It was called advanced chess. And in these games, any combination of humans and computers could play against one another. Now, what's really exciting for us as educators, and really promising for us as humans, is that until really recently, the winners of these cyborg chess tournaments were not the most powerful computers or the greatest human grandmasters. Instead, it was teams of humans using regular laptops. So our potential skill at coaching machines, our better ability to learn how to use them creatively, wins out over machines or humans alone. Now, down the coast from rocket ship schools at a place called High Tech High in San Diego, I saw students learning to use tech in this way. At High Tech High, on top of the normal English and maths and science classes, about half of the kids' time is put into big interdisciplinary projects. So one class I went into felt like a futuristic design lab. In the same class, 2 groups of students were experimenting with biodegradable seed pods. Another couple of groups of students was planning to script and produce their own documentary, and a third group were building their own drones completely from scratch. The idea was that they were going to finish this project at the end of the term with an excursion into the California wilderness. They were going to fly their drones over a national park with cameras mounted on them to do a survey of the degradation of plant species. They were going to then replenish the missing species using their biodegradable seed pods. And finally, the documentary crew was going to film the whole thing and put it up on YouTube to raise awareness of environmental issues. Now, these students were 16 and 17 years old, and it might seem like the kind of thing that you will only encounter somewhere like California. But it gave me real hope about the adaptive power of our minds, that our brains are capable of more, and that if we use tech in the right way, we can enhance our human intelligence. One of the teachers, I thought, captured it really well. She said to me, look, the thing that we have to do today, we shouldn't be asking what our machines can do for us, but instead we should be asking what we can do with our machines. Now, from High Tech High, I journeyed on to try to discover how we could use education to make our society stronger. Now, if I was doing it today, I might have headed to Estonia, but this was a couple of years ago, before the latest PISA results, and so I went to Finland and visited the classroom of the country's most famous teacher, a guy called Pekka Peura. So at the start of his class, Peura flashed up a question on the interactive whiteboard. Then he didn't give them the answer, but instead asked students to beam in their answers A, B, C, D or E, which he displayed as a bar chart. He then asked the kids to turn and talk to each other. What answer had they given? Why had they given that answer? And then after a few minutes, he got them to beam in their answers again. He displayed them in the bar chart, and this time the bar chart had shifted. The students had essentially taught each other. Peura told me afterwards that he saw his job as being one of giving kids the skills and attitudes that they needed to learn things for themselves. He'd studied how Google creates its most successful teams and was using those principles to guide his practice in the classroom. At the start of term, he gave students all the materials they needed, the tests, the answers to the tests, the online resources, spreadsheets so they could see what other students felt they had strengths in or weaknesses in. And then he saw his job as coaching them individually and collectively on their abilities as learners, giving them feedback on things like their collaboration, their creativity, their perseverance. At the end of the year, he was so confident in his methods that he even had students choose their own grades. Now, this is set against this backdrop that we all understand that Finns love education. There are huge numbers of applications for every place on a primary teacher training course in Finland. The profession is highly valued, and that training for teachers includes fun things like learning how to ice skate and how to play the piano. And it's one of the most prestigious jobs that you can do. And of course, coming from the UK, I had a different vision for this, and I sort of said to Pekka Peura, well, what happens when students fall behind in this approach of yours? And he looked at me strangely and said, look, what is behind? His idea was that every student was different, that they learned at different paces and in different ways, and the thing to have in a classroom was an environment in which people felt safe to fail. If the students felt safe to fail, that was how they would make progress, that was how they would learn. Now, I think this is an important lesson for us if we want to grow creativity. Finland does still make more of its people by many measures than any other country in the world. It tops the World Economic Forum's Human Capital Index. It's also the happiest country in the world by some measures according to the UN, and it's a hive of creativity with creative companies and unique teenage pastimes like this one I discovered of hobby horsing, which is an imaginary kind of show jumping that's apparently popular with Finnish teens. It's also got more heavy metal bands per capita than any other country in the world, and Pekka Peura was a drummer in one. So as I encountered all of these stories around the world, I thought often about my students back in South London. We had succeeded in the end, at least in what we set out to do. All of the students I taught got the C grade or better that they needed to go on to get their GCSEs. But the way that we got there, thinking back on it, I realised that I'd failed them. We'd used lots of hours of practicing exam technique and extra English classes, and that wasn't setting up those students to succeed in the world as it is today, but just to do well on their exams. I think that all of my students were and are capable of much more than I was able to give them. And I think across the world today that's true for the majority of kids. There are hundreds of millions, first of all, of kids that don't even have access to a quality education in the first place. Even in a country like Estonia, which has great kindergartens, fantastic teachers, really good outcomes, a comprehensive system, really good tech, there's still room for growth. Students aren't always happy at school. A significant proportion of students drop out before high school graduation. There's some feeling that school isn't meeting the needs of the world today. And in general, I think that's true. School isn't giving kids all that they need to thrive in today's world, let alone equipping them to take on big challenges like the automation of jobs or rising inequality globally or climate change. But I think that school could do that. All children are capable of learning as much as the kids in South Korea learn. All kids can learn to use tech creatively or learn to collaborate like they're doing in High Tech High. All students can learn to sort of be productive and creative citizens as part of a cohesive society like they do in Finland. So to date, there have already been 3 big revolutions in the way that we learn. There was a cognitive revolution 100,000 years ago where something changed in our brains and language emerged with which we could accelerate the development of our culture and pass knowledge between the generations. Then, about 10,000 years ago, came a schooling revolution where the institution of school was created for the first time to teach a new human technology of reading and writing, which had just been invented. And then, most recently, 500 years ago, came a mass education revolution where changes to religion and the invention of the printing press meant that literacy could grow across the world. I think that today we stand on the cusp of a 4th revolution. if we harness what we know about the brain, the neuroscience and psychology in early child development, if we intelligently use our powerful new tools, our computers, our AI, our biotech even, and if we reimagine the purpose of learning as being an engine of human cognition and creativity and cooperation, I think that we can bring about a learning revolution. I think this is even more true and even more important as we go through this pandemic. The pandemic has increased the importance of e-schooling in order to have more resilient systems. It's made it even more important that students have digital skills so that they can manage learning from home themselves. Even more important that they have learning to learn skills so they can manage their own learning. It's also shown the importance of us ensuring that our education system strengthen the mental and physical well-being of our students and develop their ability to cooperate. It's also revealed the absolutely central role that schools play in our societies. Now, in my journey into the future, I found that in an era defined by technology, the most important science won't be computer science, it will be the learning sciences. And our greatest invention is not going to be the smartphone or some new bit of AI, our greatest invention is school. And finally, the most vital profession is not going to be computer programmer. The most vital profession in the future is going to be the teacher. So in one of my last places that I visited in my journey was somewhere called the Relay Graduate School of Education. It's in the US. There they imagine training teachers like we now train doctors, with a 10-year training program. You start with 3 years of practical training, you mix that with theory, another 3 years you become an expert in your subject area, and then finally you become a specialist in something like your subject or data and analytics or how to coach groups of kids to be successful. In the future, as part of this revolution, I think that teachers are going to be masters of the ultimate human profession. They'll be experts in their subject area. They'll know the latest psychology to motivate students. They'll use bits of tech to outsource some aspects of their teaching, like they're doing in rocket ship schools. They'll essentially be masters of the most compelling and most important of 21st century professions. Now, to end, I want to leave you with an old Chinese saying. That's if your plan is for 1 year, you should plant rice. If your plan is for 10 years, you should plant trees. If your plan is for 100 years, you should educate your children. The most urgent question for us today is not how can we accelerate the development of our technologies, it's how can we accelerate the development of ourselves. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for this story. It was really inspiring to hear your ideas. Now let's take some questions, will we? Alex, what do you think the future school will look like, and will we have robots instead of teachers?
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I don't think that's exactly true. I think that AI will change the teaching profession, but it's not that you'll see a robot in a classroom. Instead, certain parts of the job of a teacher could be automated. So already there are adaptive learning platforms that automate a learner's experience in choosing different content, or platforms that do assessment or help school administrators to organize curriculum, or that do data analysis. And I think these bits of the profession will become taken over by robots. But that's a very small part of what teaching involves. Teaching is all about, love for a subject, the ability to engage socially with other humans, between teachers and students, to work with peers, to motivate. And I think to be able to understand sort of an individual's needs and wants as a learner. And I think those aspects of the profession will always be to do with human to human relationships.
Thank you.
Do you have children of your own?
I don't yet have children of my own, but I hope to before too long.
But if you
if you had children,
yeah, then which country would you like them to go to school?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think there are different qualities that you can see in different countries around the world. So if you had a child and you wanted them to get a really good understanding of the latest technology and creativity, you might want to send them to a school in Silicon Valley. If you had a child and you wanted them to have a very traditional kind of education, you might try to send them to a traditional school in England. If you wanted them to be really good at maths, maybe you would send them to a school in Shanghai. But actually, I think the place that I thought I would most want to send my own children was schools in Finland. And it might be a bit of a cliche to say that in Estonia. Perhaps it would be even better to send them to a school in Estonia, which I know has fantastic schools. But I think that what I saw there was just younger students from age 0 to 7 having fantastic kindergarten experiences. The primary schools I thought were lovely in terms of encouraging students' creativity and freedom and ability to work in a community together. And so I thought that was the setting that I would be happiest sending my kids.
Thank you. As you mentioned Estonia already, Alex, is there anything extra that you like about Estonian educational system?
Well, so I've been fortunate to spend quite a lot of time in Estonia, and I think there are a few things that I really like about what happens there. So again, I think that there's fantastic sort of early childhood provision in Estonia. Younger kids are looked after really well. I think it's fantastic that there's such a huge array of languages that students learn while they're at school. It's amazing how many different languages Estonians speak. I think that lots of the teachers that I've spoken to there are very forward-thinking in their profession, looking for ways to improve what they're doing in the classroom, reading the latest research, engaging in what's happening in other countries. And I think, that fact that teachers are learners and are seeking to do new things in education is a sign of a really powerful education system. And I just think the school environments that I've been to have been environments in which, it seems to me that students have a chance to develop their sense of identity, but they're also part of a community. They have a really nice mix of, freedom and an opportunity to learn. So I think, I've loved my visits to Estonia, and I think we have a lot to learn from the way that schools work in the country.
Thank you.
Why did you decide to become a teacher?
Good question. So I think it was partly to do with the fact that my mum was a teacher. So my mum taught art in a college near to where we grew up. And I think she instilled in me some values about the importance of education. Both of her parents, my grandparents, had to leave school when they were very young, at about 14. But they both valued education really highly. And I think they instilled that value in our family. And then I went to a really nice primary school, and I went to a really good secondary school, and I had lots of advantages of a good education. And so I wanted to become a teacher in order to, give that opportunity to others, to try to give a good education to other people.
Right. We have another question from our viewer, and it is we would all like to do more as teachers, but the resources are limited. What do you think, Alex, we should all do less as teachers and school leaders?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that there are ways of saving teacher time that enable us to be better at our work. I think that potentially, based on my experience in the UK and around the world, there's a couple of things. One, I think, is administration. So here in the UK, certainly, and in lots of countries, a large amount of teacher time is spent sort of in administration, in sort of doing things that need to be done for the school system, kids' absences or, recording grades. And I think a lot of those things we could potentially automate, or we could find technological tools to help us with to save teacher time. That was what was happening in rocket ship schools, for example. It was all about saving the teachers' time so they could focus on the learning of students. I think we could potentially do something. Maybe we could find ways of automating aspects of assessment to sort of speed up that process, to give teachers, already analysed information about how their students are doing. We could potentially centralise within schools some of the lesson planning, some of the development of units of work in order, again, to free up a little bit more of teacher time to be able to work in a more differentiated way with students. But I recognise that that is one of the big challenges in education, that it is a zero-sum game when it comes to making decisions about spending money. But it's interesting, if you look at the global research, that there isn't necessarily a correlation between the amount of money that's spent on education and how well students do. It often comes down to, how well teachers are trained, how well students are set up from early on in their lives to succeed in their education, and also the values that society holds around the importance of education and the role that parents and families play in that as well.
Thank you. And another question here. If you could go back to your students, back to school, and do just one thing differently, what would it be?
Oh, I think about this question a lot. So I think that when I became a teacher in the UK, I became really deeply overcome by the way the system thought about education, which was, I started thinking almost from the beginning about how to help my students doing well in their exams. And I just got stuck in that logic. And I think what I would do differently today would be, I would start by really getting to know who those students were, like trying to build very deep relationships with them and get to know their families more deeply. I know that's something that happens in other countries already, but I'd want to know their motivations, their interests. And then I was an English teacher, and so instead of just asking myself, well, how do I help these students to do well in their English exams, which was the question that I asked myself at the beginning, I would instead be asking myself, how do I help these students to develop a love of story, a love of literature, to be able to tell their own stories? I think I would have a much greater sense of my purpose and want to understand the purpose of my students and make that the starting point of my teaching.
That sounds great. Thank you, Alex, so much for your time and for your devotion in education.